Sometimes the deepest connections are found in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely souls. When 8-year-old Elsie lost her grandfather 6 months ago, she thought she had said goodbye to everything that reminded her of his gentle hands and warm voice. But then a scraggly fox appeared at her garden gate, following her everywhere with amber eyes that seemed to recognize something in her that she couldn't understand. Day after day, the timid creature waited for her after school, watched from the edge of the woods during her evening walks, and somehow knew exactly where to find her. Elsie's grandmother finally told her the truth that would break her heart wide open. The fox had been her grandfather's secret companion, a rescued kit he had cared for in his old workshop, feeding it by hand and speaking to it in the same gentle tones he once used with her. After his death, the lost animal had been searching for the one person who still carried his scent and his love. But what was the final promise her grandfather had made to this faithful creature that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Millhaven like a gentle blanket, softening the edges of the old stone cottages that lined Maple Street. Elsie May Whitmore pressed her face against the cool kitchen window, watching the world wake up in shades of grey and gold. At 8 years old, she had learned that mornings could be the loneliest time of day, when the silence reminded her most of what was missing. 6 months had passed since Grandfather Samuel's heart had simply stopped while he sat reading in his favorite chair, but the house still felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for his footsteps on the wooden floors. The workshop behind the house remained exactly as he had left it, tools hanging in perfect order, his reading glasses folded on the workbench, and that familiar smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco lingering in the air. "Elsie, dear, your breakfast is getting cold," called Grandmother Ruth from the kitchen table, her voice carrying that gentle firmness that had guided 3 generations of Whitmores. At 72, Ruth Whitmore still moved with purpose through their modest home, but her eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there when Samuel was alive. Elsie turned from the window and settled into her chair, the same one she'd claimed since she was tall enough to reach the table. The kitchen felt too big now, with Samuel's empty chair pushed carefully under the table, his favorite coffee mug washed and stored in the cupboard. Ruth had suggested moving it, but neither of them could bring themselves to change what had been his place for 47 years. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday while you were at school," Ruth said, buttering a piece of toast with careful strokes. "She mentioned seeing you talking to something by the old oak tree again." Elsie's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "I wasn't talking to anything, Grandma. I was just thinking out loud." Ruth's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Margaret Henderson had lived next door for 30 years and had developed an unfortunate habit of keeping track of everyone's business with the dedication of a town historian. She meant well, but her concern often felt more like scrutiny. "That woman sees everything," Ruth murmured, then looked directly at her granddaughter. "What were you thinking about so intently?" The truth sat heavy in Elsie's chest. For the past 2 weeks, she had noticed the fox. At first, it had been just a flash of red fur disappearing behind trees when she walked home from school. Then she began seeing it more clearly, a thin, somewhat raggedy creature that watched her from a distance, with eyes that seemed too knowing for a wild animal. "Just school things," Elsie said, which wasn't entirely a lie. She had been wondering if animals could feel sadness the way people did, and whether the fox's careful distance meant it was lonely too. After breakfast, Elsie gathered her schoolbooks and kissed her grandmother's soft cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and the faint sweetness of the honey. Ruth stirred into her morning tea. The walk to Millhaven Elementary took her past the workshop, and she always slowed her steps there, remembering Samuel Whitmore had been a carpenter by trade and a storyteller by nature. Every afternoon after school, Elsie would find him in the workshop, his weathered hands shaping wood into something beautiful and useful. He would tell her stories while he worked, Tales of the old days when Millhaven was just a trading post, stories about the characters who had built the town, and gentle lessons about treating all living things with kindness. Every creature has a purpose, little bird, he would say, using his special name for her. Sometimes we just have to be patient enough to discover what it is. The workshop tools still waited for hands that would never return to them. The half-finished rocking horse Samuel had been crafting for the new baby at the Morrissey farm stood frozen in time, its wooden eyes carved but not yet painted, its rockers sanded smooth but never tested. At school, Elsie's teacher, Miss Caroline, noticed her distraction during arithmetic. "Elsie, dear, you seem far away today," she said gently, her hand resting briefly on Elsie's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Miss Caroline. I was thinking about my grandfather's stories." Miss Caroline's expression softened. She had known Samuel Whitmore well. Everyone in Millhaven had. He had built the original schoolhouse, repaired countless pieces of furniture for families who couldn't afford new ones, and had a way of appearing whenever someone needed help, as if he possessed some internal compass that pointed toward kindness. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," Miss Caroline said. "I'm sure his stories will stay with you always." During recess, Elsie's best friend Tommy Peterson found her sitting alone under the old maple tree that dominated the schoolyard. "You're thinking about your grandfather again, aren't you?" he asked, settling beside her on the grass. Tommy was 9, a year older and 2 inches taller, with freckles that multiplied in the summer sun and an uncanny ability to know when his friends needed someone to listen. "Sometimes I feel like he's trying to tell me something," Elsie admitted. "Like there are things he wanted me to know but didn't have time to say." Tommy picked up a fallen leaf and turned it over in his hands, examining its intricate veins. "My dad says that when people love us, they leave pieces of themselves behind. Maybe you just have to look for the pieces." That afternoon, walking home from school, Elsie deliberately took the long way past the edge of Millbrook Woods. The fox was there, as she had somehow known it would be, sitting beneath a cluster of birch trees about 20 yards from the path. This time, instead of hurrying past, she stopped. The animal was smaller than she had initially thought, with a coat that had seen better days. Its fur was patchy in places, and she could see the outline of ribs beneath its russet coat. But its eyes, those amber eyes, held an intelligence and sadness that made her heart ache. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The fox tilted its head, ears pricked forward but didn't run. They regarded each other in silence, two lonely souls recognizing something familiar in each other's presence. When Elsie finally continued home, the fox followed at a distance, keeping to the tree line but never losing sight of her. By the time she reached her grandmother's garden gate, the animal had vanished, but she could feel it watching from somewhere in the gathering shadows. That evening, as Ruth prepared supper, Elsie sat at the kitchen table trying to focus on her homework, but finding her thoughts returning to Amber Eyes and the strange comfort she had felt in that silent exchange. "Grandma," she said carefully, "did Grandfather ever talk about the animals in the woods?" Ruth paused in her stirring, a distant look crossing her face. "Your grandfather had a way with animals, always did, even as a boy. His mother used to say he could charm birds from trees and coax wild rabbits to eat from his hand. Did he ever mention a fox?" The wooden spoon went still in Ruth's hand. She turned slowly, her eyes searching Elsie's face with sudden intensity. "Why do you ask about a fox, child?" Something in her grandmother's voice made Elsie choose her words carefully. "I've seen one in the woods. It doesn't seem afraid of people the way wild animals usually are." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the workshop, visible through the kitchen window. When she spoke again, her voice held a note of something that might have been recognition. "Your grandfather believed that animals could sense things about people, whether they were kind or cruel, whether they could be trusted. He always said that if a wild creature sought out human company, there was usually a reason." That night, after the dishes were washed and Ruth had settled into her evening routine of reading by lamplight, Elsie lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her. The old timbers creaked like gentle sighs, and, somewhere in the walls, mice scurried along their ancient highways. Through her bedroom window, she could see the workshop silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Grandfather Samuel had installed a small window in the back wall so he could watch for deer and rabbits in the early morning, and sometimes, on clear nights, Elsie thought she could see a faint glow from within, as if his spirit still worked by lamplight. But tonight, as she pressed her face to the glass, she saw something else entirely. A small, familiar shape sat in the workshop doorway, perfectly still, as if keeping vigil. The fox had come home. 3 days later, Elsie found the fox limping. She had developed a routine of walking slowly past the workshop each morning before school, hoping for another glimpse of the creature that seemed to understand her loneliness. This morning, however, instead of the alert, watchful animal she had grown accustomed to seeing, she discovered the fox collapsed beneath the old shed, its breathing shallow, and its left hind leg held at an unnatural angle. "Oh, no," she whispered, dropping her school books and approaching carefully. The fox lifted its head weakly, those familiar amber eyes now clouded with pain. But it didn't try to flee. Instead, it made a soft, whimpering sound that cut straight through Elsie's heart. Ruth appeared at the kitchen door, drawn by the sound of Elsie's distress. "What is it, dear?" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the injured animal, her hand flying to cover her mouth. "Grandma, we have to help," Elsie said urgently, already kneeling beside the fox despite her grandmother's sharp intake of breath. "Something's wrong with its leg." "Elsie, step away from that animal this instant," Ruth commanded, but her voice lacked conviction. She moved closer despite her own warnings, her experienced eye taking in the fox's condition. After raising children and grandchildren in the country, she could recognize genuine distress in any creature. The fox's breathing was labored, and its coat, always somewhat unkempt, now looked dull and lifeless. When Elsie reached out slowly, the animal didn't flinch away from her touch, a sign that spoke to both its desperate condition and an unusual level of trust. "We can't just leave it here," Elsie pleaded. "Grandfather would never leave a hurt animal to suffer." At the mention of Samuel, Ruth's resolve crumbled visibly. She looked from her granddaughter's determined face to the injured fox, and something in her expression shifted. "Dr. Morrison is the only veterinarian within 20 miles, but I don't know if he treats wild animals. We have to try." The ride to Dr. Morrison's clinic passed in tense silence, the fox wrapped carefully in one of Samuel's old flannel shirts and cradled in Elsie's lap. Every bump in the road drew a soft whine from the injured animal, and Elsie found herself whispering reassurances in the same gentle tone her grandfather had used when she scraped her knees or woke from nightmares. Dr. James Morrison had been Millhaven's veterinarian for nearly 30 years, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and an infinite patience for both animals and their worried human companions. When Ruth and Elsie appeared at his clinic carrying a bundle of flannel, his eyebrows rose in mild surprise, but he ushered them immediately into an examination room. "Let's see what we have here," he murmured, carefully unwrapping the fox. His hands moved with practiced gentleness as he examined the injured leg, his face growing increasingly thoughtful. "This is an old fracture that never healed properly. See how the bone has set incorrectly. This animal has been suffering for quite some time." Elsie felt tears sting her eyes. "Can you help him?" "Him?" Dr. Morrison smiled slightly. "Actually, this is a female, probably about 2 years old." He paused in his examination, studying the fox's face with sudden recognition. "You know, this is quite extraordinary. I've seen this fox before." Ruth leaned forward. "You have?" "Oh, yes. Samuel brought her in several times over the past couple of years. Always paid in cash, always asked me not to mention it to anyone. Said he found her as an orphaned kit and had been caring for her ever since." Dr. Morrison's voice grew gentle. "I wondered what had become of her after Samuel passed." The revelation hit Elsie like a physical blow. Her grandfather had not only known about the fox, but had been secretly caring for it. The animal that had seemed so mysteriously drawn to her had actually been seeking something familiar, something connected to the man who had shown it kindness. "He never told us," Ruth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Samuel was like that," Dr. Morrison said with understanding. "He helped a lot of creatures over the years, but he never wanted recognition for it. Said kindness shouldn't need an audience." He returned his attention to the fox, who lay remarkably still under his examination. "This injury is several months old, probably happened around the time Samuel died, when she was trying to fend for herself after losing her caretaker." The fox's amber eyes found Elsie's face, and in that moment she understood everything. The animal hadn't been following her randomly. It had been searching for someone who carried the scent and essence of the man who had rescued and cared for it. The grandfather's flannel shirt she often wore, the hours she spent in his workshop, the gentleness he had taught her to show all living things. The fox had recognized these connections and had been drawn to the only remaining link to its lost. "Protector, what can we do for her?" Elsie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, his skilled hands continuing their examination. "The fracture is beyond surgical repair at this point, but she's not in immediate danger. With proper care, good nutrition, a safe place to rest, and treatment for the malnutrition she suffered, she could have a decent quality of life. Limp will be permanent, but it doesn't have to be debilitating. Would it be possible for her to live with people?" Ruth asked carefully. "Normally, I would strongly advise against keeping a wild fox as a pet," Dr. Morrison said. "But this isn't a normal situation. This fox has been habituated to human care since she was very young. Releasing her back to the wild in her current condition would likely be a death sentence, and clearly she's already chosen her new caretaker." He nodded toward Elsie, whose small hand rested gently on the fox's head, offering what comfort she could. The animal had relaxed under her touch, its breathing becoming more regular. "Your grandfather left detailed notes about her care." "Doctor," Morrison continued, reaching into a filing cabinet and retrieving a thick folder. "Diet, behavioral observations, even her preferences for sleeping spots and favorite activities." He was quite thorough. As he opened the folder, Elsie glimpsed her grandfather's familiar handwriting covering page after page of careful observations. At the top of the first page, in Samuel's neat script, were the words, "Ruby, found motherless, March 15th, 2021. She trusts easily and loves unconditionally, like the best of us should." "Ruby," Elsie repeated softly, and the fox's ears twitched in response to the name. Dr. Morrison smiled. "She knows her name. Samuel chose well. She does have the coloring of a little red jewel, doesn't she?" Ruth watched the interaction between her granddaughter and the injured fox with growing understanding. "Dr. Morrison, if we decided to care for her, what would that involve?" "Daily feeding, monitoring her health, providing safe shelter and lots of patience as she adjusts to life without Samuel. It's not a decision to make lightly. Foxes can live 12 to 15 years, and she'll require consistent care throughout her life." He paused thoughtfully. "But I've seen the notes Samuel left. He believed that this fox was meant to be part of someone's life, that she had a purpose beyond simple survival." As they prepared to leave the clinic with Ruby resting in a proper carrier Dr. Morrison had provided, along with detailed care instructions and enough medication to help with her recovery, Elsie felt something shift inside her chest. The hollow ache that had lived there since her grandfather's death was still present, but it was now accompanied by something else: purpose, responsibility, and the beginning of hope. "Grandfather knew, didn't he?" she asked her grandmother as they drove home. "Somehow, he knew she'd find me." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the road, but her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Your grandfather had a way of seeing connections that others missed. He always said that love finds a way to continue, even after we're gone." That evening, as Ruby rested comfortably in a makeshift bed in Samuel's workshop, surrounded by the familiar scents and sounds that had meant safety to her for 2 years, Elsie sat beside her, gently stroking the fox's soft fur. "I understand." "Now," she whispered, "you weren't lost at all. You were looking for home." The first week of caring for Ruby taught Elsie more about patience and responsibility than all her previous 8 years combined. Dr. Morrison's instructions were precise and extensive, but putting them into practice required a dedication that surprised even Ruth with its intensity. Every morning before school, Elsie would visit the workshop where Ruby had claimed Samuel's old armchair as her preferred resting spot. The fox would lift her head at the sound of Elsie's footsteps, her amber eyes brightening with recognition, and something that looked remarkably like relief. The morning feeding routine had become a careful dance of trust. Ruby would accept food directly from Elsie's hand, but only after a few moments of patient coaxing. "She's particular about her schedule," Ruth observed, watching from the workshop doorway as Elsie measured out the special mixture Dr. Morrison had recommended. "Just like your grandfather was." The comparison felt both comforting and slightly overwhelming. Samuel had made everything look effortless, but Elsie was discovering that caring for another living creature required constant attention and decision-making. Should Ruby's water dish be moved closer to her sleeping spot? Was she eating enough? Did the slight change in her breathing pattern mean something significant? Ruth had initially expressed concerns about the arrangement, worried that caring for a wild animal might be too much responsibility for an 8-year-old. But as the days passed, she began to see something in her granddaughter that had been missing since Samuel's death, a sense of purpose that brought light back to her eyes. "Dr. Morrison left quite detailed notes," Ruth said, examining the folder, "of instructions. Your grandfather was remarkably thorough." Among the pages of feeding schedules and behavioral observations, Elsie discovered a handwritten chart in her grandfather's neat script. It detailed not just Ruby's physical needs, but her preferences and personality quirks. "Likes morning sun on her face," read one entry. "Becomes anxious during thunderstorms, stays close to workbench." Another note made Elsie smile. "Responds to gentle humming, especially old folk songs." Testing this last observation, Elsie began humming Red River Valley while preparing Ruby's evening meal. The fox's ears perked forward immediately, and she rose from her resting place to sit closer to the sound. When Elsie transitioned to Amazing Grace, Ruby settled down completely, her eyes half closing in apparent contentment. "Well, I'll be," Ruth murmured from the doorway. "She really does love music." At school, Miss Caroline noticed the change in Elsie immediately. The distracted, grief-stricken child of recent months had been replaced by someone with renewed focus and energy. During story time, when Miss Caroline read from a book about woodland animals, Elsie contributed observations about fox behavior that impressed her classmates and teacher alike. "How do you know so much about foxes?" asked Jenny Martinez, a classmate, who had previously shown little interest in anything beyond her collection of colorful hair ribbons. "I've been reading about them," Elsie said, which was true. Dr. Morrison had provided several books about fox care and behavior, and she had been studying them with the dedication of a scholar. But the truth was more complex. She was learning about Ruby specifically, not foxes in general. Tommy Peterson, ever perceptive, pulled Elsie aside during recess. "You seem different lately. Happy different, but also worried different." Elsie considered how much to tell her best friend. The story felt too precious and fragile to share completely, but Tommy's genuine concern deserved some explanation. "I found something of my grandfather's that I'm taking care of now, something important to him." Tommy nodded seriously, understanding that some explanations had boundaries. "Is it helping? Taking care of his important thing?" "Yes," Elsie said with certainty. "It makes me feel closer to him." The afternoons had become Elsie's favorite time. After completing her homework at the kitchen table under Ruth's watchful eye, she would spend an hour in the workshop with Ruby. The fox had grown stronger each day, her coat regaining some of its natural luster and her movements becoming more confident despite the permanent limp. Ruby seemed to enjoy these quiet companionship sessions as much as Elsie did. Sometimes the fox would explore the familiar workshop spaces while Elsie sat reading, but she always returned to settle near the girl's feet, as if reassuring herself that her new caretaker wasn't going anywhere. Mrs. Henderson, the observant neighbor, had begun asking pointed questions about Elsie's after-school activities. "I've noticed you spending quite a bit of time in your grandfather's workshop, dear. Are you perhaps taking up woodworking?" Ruth fielded these inquiries with diplomatic skill. Elsie finds comfort in her grandfather's space. It's part of her healing process. This was true as far as it went, but both Ruth and Elsie knew that discovery of Ruby might create complications. Wild animals, even domesticated ones, were subject to local regulations that neither of them fully understood. Dr. Morrison had assured them that Ruby's situation was unique and likely wouldn't attract official attention, but discretion seemed wise. The evening routine had evolved into something that brought peace to both Elsie and Ruby. As the sun set and the workshop filled with golden light, Elsie would sit in the small chair Samuel had built for her years ago, reading aloud from her school books or one of the adventure stories her grandfather had loved. Ruby would settle nearby, sometimes grooming herself, sometimes simply watching Elsie with alert, intelligent eyes. "She understands more than people think," Elsie told her grandmother one evening. "When I talk to her about my day, she tilts her head like she's really listening." "Animals often understand more than we give them credit for," Ruth agreed. "Your grandfather always said that Ruby was particularly intelligent, even for a fox." These conversations about Samuel's relationship with Ruby had become precious to both grandmother and granddaughter. Each new detail about his secret caretaking revealed another layer of his character. His capacity for quiet kindness, his belief in helping creatures that others might dismiss as unworthy of attention. One evening, while brushing Ruby's coat with a soft brush Dr. Morrison had recommended, Elsie discovered something that made her catch her breath. Around Ruby's neck, partially hidden by her thick fur, was a simple leather collar. It was clearly handmade, stitched with the careful precision that marked all of Samuel's work. With trembling fingers, Elsie examined the collar more closely. On a small metal tag attached to the leather, engraved in Samuel's neat lettering, were two words that made tears spring to her eyes: Elsie's Ruby. Ruth, summoned by her granddaughter's amazed whisper, examined the collar with wonder. "He made this for her, but he put your name on it." The implications settled over them both slowly. Samuel had anticipated this connection, had somehow known that Ruby would eventually become part of Elsie's life. The collar represented not just his care for the fox, but his faith in his granddaughter's capacity for love and responsibility. "How did he know?" Elsie asked softly, her small hand resting gently on Ruby's head. "Your grandfather saw things differently than most people," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "He believed that love creates connections that survive even death." That night, as Elsie prepared Ruby's sleeping area with fresh blankets and ensured her water dish was full, the fox nuzzled her hand gently, the first truly affectionate gesture she had made. In that moment, Elsie understood that she and Ruby were no longer just caretaker and animal, but companions chosen for each other by someone who had loved them both. 2 weeks into Ruby's recovery, Ruth made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about Samuel's final months. While cleaning out his bedroom dresser, a task she had been postponing since his death, she found a sealed envelope tucked beneath his handkerchiefs with "For Elsie" written across the front in his careful script. "I think your grandfather wanted you to have this," Ruth said, her voice trembling slightly as she handed the envelope to her granddaughter after dinner that evening. Elsie's hands shook as she opened the letter, unfolding pages filled with Samuel's familiar handwriting. Ruby, as if sensing the solemnity of the moment, settled quietly at Elsie's feet in the kitchen where they had gathered. "My dearest little bird," the letter began, and Elsie's eyes immediately filled with tears at the endearment only her grandfather had used. "If you are reading this, it means I'm no longer with you in body, but I hope you know that love never truly leaves us. It simply changes form, like water becoming vapor, still present, but harder to see. By now, you have likely met Ruby, and I hope you understand why I kept her existence a secret. Not because I was ashamed of caring for her, but because I knew that someday she would need you more than she needed me. Foxes are remarkable creatures, Elsie. They mate for life, they care for their families with fierce devotion, and they remember kindness with a loyalty that puts many humans to shame. I found Ruby when she was barely 6 weeks old, orphaned and nearly starved after her mother was killed by a careless driver on the old county road. She was so small she fit in my palm, and so frightened she trembled at every sound. But even then I could see intelligence in her eyes, and a spirit that refused to surrender despite her circumstances. Caring for her taught me something important about love, little bird. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give another creature is not just our protection, but our faith in their ability to love in return. Ruby learned to trust because I never doubted her capacity for affection. She learned to be gentle because I showed her gentleness. She learned to hope because I never treated her situation as hopeless. I believe the same is true of people, especially children. We become what others believe we can become. And I believe, Elsie, that you have the same gentle strength that allowed me to care for Ruby. You have your grandmother's wisdom, your mother's creativity, and something uniquely your own, a heart that sees the worth in creatures others might overlook. Ruby knows things about you that you may not even know about yourself yet. Animals have a way of recognizing kindred spirits. If she has come to you, it is because she senses in you the same capacity for love that drew her to me. In the workshop, beneath the loose floorboard by the east window, you will find supplies I gathered for Ruby's continued care: food, medicine, and detailed notes about her health and habits. But more importantly, you will find my trust in your ability to give her the love and attention she deserves. Caring for another living creature is one of life's greatest privileges, little bird. It teaches us patience, responsibility, and the deep satisfaction that comes from putting another's needs before our own comfort. These lessons will serve you well throughout your life, in relationships with animals and people alike. Ruby may be the first creature you are called to care for, but I suspect she will not be the last. You have the gift of seeing the vulnerable and the overlooked, of recognizing that every living thing has value and dignity. This is a rare and precious ability, and I hope you will trust it as you grow. Remember that love is not always easy or convenient. There will be difficult days when Ruby is unwell, or when caring for her requires sacrifices of time and energy you might prefer to spend elsewhere. But love that costs us nothing teaches us nothing. It is in the difficult moments that we discover what we are truly capable of giving. Be patient with Ruby as she adjusts to life without me. She may seem anxious or withdrawn at first, and she will need time to transfer her trust from me to you. Speak to her gently, move slowly around her, and let her approach you rather than forcing interaction. She will come to love you in her own time and in her own way. Most importantly, little bird, know that in caring for Ruby, you are not just helping one small creature. You are continuing a legacy of kindness that I hope will outlive us both. Every act of compassion creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. Ruby may touch other lives through your care, and those lives may touch others in turn. I am so proud of the person you are becoming, and I have complete faith in the person you will become. Ruby is lucky to have you, just as I was lucky to have you as my granddaughter. With all my love and trust, Grandfather Samuel P.S. Ruby has a particular fondness for scrambled eggs on Sunday mornings and enjoys being brushed just before sunset. She also responds well to gentle conversation. She may not understand the words, but she understands the tone and intention behind them. By the time Elsie finished reading, both she and Ruth were crying quietly, overwhelmed by Samuel's words and the depth of planning and love they represented. The letter answered so many questions while creating new ones about the grandfather they thought they had known completely. "He planned all of this," Elsie whispered, looking down at Ruby, who had somehow moved closer during the reading and now rested her head against Elsie's leg. "He knew she would find me." Ruth dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Your grandfather always saw connections that others missed. He had faith in things that couldn't be proven, only felt." That evening, following Samuel's instructions, they found the loose floorboard in the workshop. Beneath it was a metal box containing everything he had described: veterinary supplies, detailed feeding charts, behavioral notes, and something extra he hadn't mentioned in the letter, a small wooden figurine he had carved of Ruby, capturing her alert expression and delicate features with remarkable skill. "He spent hours watching her to get the details right," Ruth observed, examining the carving. "Every whisker, every curve of her ears." Holding the figurine, Elsie felt the full weight of her grandfather's trust and expectations. He had believed not only that she could care for Ruby, but that doing so would help her grow into the person she was meant to become. The responsibility felt enormous, but it was tempered by the knowledge that love had prepared the way. "I won't let you down, grandfather," she whispered to the workshop air, thick with sawdust and memories. As if in response, Ruby stretched and settled more comfortably against her feet, her breathing deep and peaceful. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by Samuel's tools and the scent of cedar shavings, 3 generations were connected by love that had found a way to continue beyond death, through the trust placed in small hands and the faith that kindness creates its own legacy. 3 weeks after finding Samuel's letter, Elsie made another discovery that revealed the true scope of her grandfather's compassion. While organizing the workshop's storage area, with Ruby supervising from her favorite perch on Samuel's workbench, Elsie noticed a small leather pouch tucked behind a collection of wood stain jars. The pouch was soft with age and use, its drawstring worn smooth by countless openings and closings. Inside, she found an assortment of items that initially seemed random: dried herbs wrapped in cloth packets, small glass vials containing various oils and tinctures, bandaging materials, and a notebook filled with Samuel's careful observations about natural remedies for common animal ailments. "Grandma, look at this!" Elsie called, emerging from the workshop with the medicine bag clutched carefully in her hands. Ruth examined the contents with growing amazement. The notebook contained detailed entries about treating everything from infected wounds to digestive problems, with specific notes about which local plants could be harvested for medicinal purposes and how to prepare them safely. "Willow bark tea for pain relief," Ruth read aloud from one entry. "Honey and chamomile for digestive upset. Calendula salve for cuts and scrapes." Your grandfather was quite the country veterinarian, wasn't he? The implications slowly became clear as they read further. Samuel hadn't just cared for Ruby. He had been quietly treating injured and sick woodland animals for years, creating an unofficial wildlife sanctuary that nobody in Millhaven had known existed. "Look at this entry from last spring," Ruth said, pointing to a page filled with Samuel's neat handwriting. "Young raccoon, hit by car on Miller Road, broken rib, deep laceration on left side. Treated with comfrey poultice and kept in workshop for 10 days, released healthy." There's even a little sketch of the raccoon. Elsie studied the drawing, a detailed illustration showing the animal's markings and the location of its injuries. Every page revealed similar stories: an owl with a damaged wing, a family of opossums whose mother had been killed, a deer with an infected hoof. Samuel had documented each case with the thoroughness of a trained veterinarian and the compassion of someone who saw individual worth in every suffering creature. "He helped so many animals," Elsie whispered, turning page after page of rescue stories. "And nobody knew." "That was your grandfather's way," Ruth said softly. "He never needed recognition for doing what he believed was right." Ruby, perhaps sensing the reverence with which they handled the medicine bag, approached and sniffed delicately at the leather pouch. Her reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She recognized the scent and began to purr, a sound Elsie had never heard from her before, but which Dr. Morrison had mentioned foxes could make when deeply content. "She remembers," Elsie said with wonder. "She remembers when Grandfather used these medicines to help other animals." Over the following days, Elsie found herself drawn repeatedly to Samuel's wildlife journals, reading about his gentle methods for approaching frightened animals, his patience in waiting for trust to develop, and his belief that every creature deserved care regardless of its species or condition. One entry, dated just 2 months before Samuel's death, particularly captured her attention. "Ruby brought me a young crow today, found with damaged wing near the old stone bridge. She carried it carefully in her mouth, barely touching it, then looked at me as if to say, 'Here is another who needs help.' Remarkable how she understands the work we do here. She has become my assistant in the truest sense." The image of Ruby, actively participating in her grandfather's rescue work, filled Elsie with a new understanding of their relationship. Ruby hadn't just been Samuel's pet. She had been his partner in a mission of compassion that extended throughout the local woodland community. This revelation transformed Elsie's perception of both her grandfather and Ruby. Every afternoon spent in the workshop took on new meaning as she began to understand that she was not just caring for one fox, but potentially continuing a legacy of service to all the vulnerable creatures in their area. The first test of this expanded responsibility came sooner than expected. While walking Ruby on the long lead Dr. Morrison had recommended for exercise, Elsie noticed the fox suddenly become alert, her head tilted towards sounds only she could hear. Ruby pulled gently but persistently toward a thick stand of elderberry bushes at the edge of the property. Following Ruby's lead, Elsie discovered a young rabbit caught in a tangle of thorny vines, its struggles only serving to embed the thorns deeper into its fur and skin. The animal was exhausted and frightened, its eyes wide with terror as it saw the approaching fox. "It's okay," Elsie said softly, immediately understanding what Samuel would have done. "Ruby won't hurt you. She's here to help." Working carefully, with a pair of gardening shears Ruth provided, Elsie freed the rabbit, while Ruby sat at a respectful distance, her posture calm and non-threatening. The process took nearly an hour, but gradually the rabbit's panic subsided as it realized no harm would come to it. When the animal was finally free, limping but mobile, Ruby did something that took Elsie's breath away. The fox approached the rabbit slowly, sniffed it gently to assess its condition, then looked directly at Elsie with an expression that seemed to ask, "Is there more we need to do?" Following her grandfather's notes and using supplies from his medicine bag, Elsie cleaned the rabbit's minor wounds and applied a small amount of healing salve. Throughout the process, Ruby remained nearby, watchful but peaceful, as if supervising Elsie's first attempt at wildlife care. "You know what we're doing, don't you?" Elsie asked Ruby as they watched the rabbit hop slowly but steadily back toward the woods. "You understand that this is important work." Ruby's amber eyes met hers with unmistakable intelligence, and what could only be described as approval. In that moment, Elsie felt a connection, not just to her grandfather's memory, but to a purpose larger than herself. That evening, she made her first entry in a new notebook, documenting the rabbit rescue with the same careful detail Samuel had used. Young cottontail rabbit caught in elderberry thorns, multiple small puncture wounds, mild exhaustion, treated with calendula salve. Ruby led me to the animal and assisted with calming process, released after 2 hours. Ruth reading over her granddaughter's shoulder, smiled with pride and something that looked like recognition. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you both." As Elsie tucked the notebook away with Samuel's wildlife journals, she realized that Ruby's role in her life was more complex than she had initially understood. The fox wasn't just a companion or even a responsibility. She was a teacher, carrying forward Samuel's knowledge and showing Elsie how to see the world through eyes of compassion. "Tomorrow we'll check that old stone bridge," Grandfather wrote. "About," Elsie told Ruby as they settled in for the evening. "If that's where animals go when they're hurt, maybe we should make sure it's safe." Ruby settled against Elsie's feet with a contented sigh. And for the first time since Samuel's death, the workshop felt not like a memorial to the past, but like the headquarters for important work that was just beginning. The old stone bridge Samuel had mentioned in his journals became Elsie's first destination in what she privately thought of as their patrol rounds. Built generations ago to span Miller Creek, the bridge had long been abandoned for vehicle traffic, but remained a crossing point for the woodland creatures that moved between the forest and the meadows beyond. Ruby seemed to understand their mission without explanation. As they approached the bridge on a crisp October morning, the fox moved with purposeful alertness, her nose testing the air and her ears swiveling to catch sounds Elsie couldn't detect. The bridge's stone foundation had developed cracks over the years, creating perfect hiding spots for small animals seeking shelter, but also potential traps for creatures unfamiliar with the structure. "Grandfather was right," Elsie murmured, examining the bridge's weathered stones. "Animals do come here when they're in trouble." Evidence of their presence was everywhere once she learned to look for it. Small tufts of fur caught on rough stone, edges, scratches in the moss that suggested claws seeking purchase, and most tellingly, drops of dried blood on the bridge's surface that spoke of injuries sustained by creatures attempting to navigate the deteriorating structure. Ruby investigated each sign with professional thoroughness, occasionally looking back at Elsie as if sharing observations. When the fox paused at a particularly dangerous gap between stones and whined softly, Elsie understood immediately. "You're right. Something could get trapped there easily." Using techniques learned from Samuel's journals, Elsie began what she privately called animal proofing the most hazardous areas of the bridge. She filled dangerous gaps with smaller stones, cleared debris that might confuse or trap small creatures, and created clear pathways that would guide animals safely across the structure. The work was more challenging than she had anticipated, requiring multiple trips and careful planning. Ruth, initially concerned about her granddaughter spending so much time alone at the remote bridge, eventually began accompanying her, bringing sandwiches and thermos bottles of hot cocoa that transformed their improvement projects into extended family expeditions. "Your grandfather would approve of what you're doing," Ruth said one afternoon, watching Elsie carefully place stones to create a shallow ramp for creatures too small to manage the bridge's higher steps. "He always believed that prevention was better than treatment." The validation meant everything to Elsie, but it was Ruby's approval that mattered most. Each improvement they made to the bridge earned an expression of fox satisfaction that Elsie was learning to read as clearly as human facial expressions. When Ruby settled contentedly on the repaired bridge surface, grooming herself in the afternoon sun, Elsie knew their work met her grandfather's standards. Their efforts attracted attention from unexpected sources. Dr. Morrison, visiting to check on Ruby's continued recovery, was amazed by the bridge improvements and the detailed documentation Elsie was maintaining of their wildlife encounters. "This is exactly the kind of preventive care that makes the biggest difference," he told Ruth, while examining Elsie's careful notes about animal traffic patterns around the bridge. "Samuel would be proud, but I'm not surprised. She has his observational skills and his instinct for practical solutions." Word of their activities spread quietly through Millhaven's small community, carried by the kind of gentle gossip that follows acts of unusual kindness. Mrs. Henderson, ever watchful, began reporting wildlife sightings to Elsie with the seriousness of someone providing crucial intelligence. "I saw a family of raccoons heading toward your bridge yesterday evening," she would announce over the back fence. The smallest one seemed to be limping slightly. These reports became the basis for expanded patrol routes that took Elsie and Ruby throughout the woodland areas surrounding Millhaven. What had begun as care for one fox had evolved into a comprehensive program of wildlife assistance that would have impressed professional conservationists. Tommy Peterson, Elsie's loyal friend, became fascinated by her new expertise and began joining their afternoon expeditions when homework and chores permitted. His enthusiasm for the work was infectious, and his willingness to carry supplies and assist with improvements made larger projects possible. "How do you know so much about what animals need?" he asked one day, while helping Elsie construct a shelter. "From storm debris near the bridge. My grandfather taught me," Elsie said simply, though the teaching had come largely through his written observations and Ruby's guidance. "He said that if you watch carefully and think about what you would need, if you were small and vulnerable, you can usually figure out how to help." This philosophy guided their expanding efforts. When autumn rains turned the area around the bridge muddy and treacherous, they constructed drainage channels. When winter approached and food sources became scarce, they established feeding stations, stocked with appropriate foods for different species. Ruby's role in these activities continued to amaze everyone who observed their partnership. The fox seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of which improvements would be most beneficial, often directing Elsie's attention to problems she might have missed. More remarkably, Ruby began actively participating in rescue efforts. When a young owl became trapped in fishing line near the creek, Ruby's careful persistence in getting Elsie's attention prevented what could have been a tragedy. When a family of mice became stranded during a flash flood, Ruby guided them to safety. With the patience of a professional rescue worker. "She's not just remembering what Samuel taught her," Dr. Morrison observed, after witnessing Ruby's gentle guidance of a confused baby deer back to its mother. "She's actively choosing to continue his work. That level of conscious cooperation is extraordinary in any animal." The partnership between girl and fox was creating something unprecedented in Millhaven, a functioning wildlife assistance program run by a child and her remarkable companion. Local farmers began consulting Elsie about humane solutions to animal problems on their property. Teachers at the elementary school invited her to share her knowledge with younger children interested in nature. Most importantly, Elsie discovered that the hollowness she had carried since Samuel's death was being filled by something sustainable and meaningful. Each animal they helped, each problem they solved, each improvement they made to the local environment strengthened her connection to her grandfather's legacy while building her own sense of purpose. "I think I understand now why grandfather kept his work secret," Elsie told Ruth one evening as they watched Ruby demonstrate perfect hunting technique to a young fox they had been caring for. "It wasn't about getting credit. It was about the work itself being important." Ruby, overhearing her name, looked up from her demonstration and approached Elsie for the gentle ear-scratching she had come to expect each evening. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their growing impact on the local wildlife community, Elsie felt truly connected to something larger than herself, a legacy of kindness that would continue as long as there were creatures in need and people willing to help them. Winter was coming, and with it, new challenges for the animals under their unofficial protection. But Elsie no longer felt daunted by the responsibility. With Ruby as her partner and Samuel's wisdom as her guide, she was ready to face whatever the season might bring. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered with the casual indifference of routine mail, despite containing words that would shatter Elsie's carefully rebuilt world. Ruth found the official envelope wedged between a seed catalogue and the electric bill, its return address bearing the logo of Henderson Development Corporation. "What is it, Grandma?" Elsie asked, looking up from her morning routine of preparing Ruby's breakfast. The fox sat patiently nearby, her amber eyes alert to the tension that had suddenly filled the kitchen. Ruth's face had gone pale as she read the letter's contents, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed the legal language that translated. To devastating simplicity. It's about the property, dear, about your grandfather's land. The letter, written in the cold terminology of business transactions, informed them that Samuel's estate had outstanding debts that exceeded the family's ability to pay. The medical bills from his final hospitalization, combined with back taxes and mortgage obligations Ruth hadn't fully understood, created a financial burden that could only be resolved through property sale. Henderson Development Corporation had made what they termed a generous offer for the 3 acres that comprised Samuel's homestead, including the house, workshop, and surrounding woodland that had become Ruby's territory, and the unofficial wildlife sanctuary Elsie had been developing. "They want to tear everything down," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Houses, a dozen new houses, where the workshop and woods are now." The implications crashed over Elsie like a physical blow. Ruby's home would disappear. The bridge they had repaired, the feeding stations they had established, the shelter areas they had created for vulnerable animals, all of it would be destroyed for suburban development. "Can't we just say no?" Elsie asked desperately. "It's our home. It's grandfather's home." Ruth's expression broke Elsie's heart before her words did. "The debts are real, sweetheart. I've been trying to manage them since your grandfather died, but his medical treatments cost so much more than we realized. If we don't sell to Henderson Development, the bank will force a sale anyway, and we'll get much less money." Ruby, sensing the distress radiating from both humans, approached and pressed against Elsie's legs in the comforting gesture she had perfected over their months together. The fox's warmth and presence provided small comfort against the magnitude of what they faced. The developer's timeline was aggressively efficient. Construction would begin in early spring, which meant the property needed to be vacant by March 1st. Any structures deemed unnecessary would be demolished to make room for the new housing development, optimistically named Millhaven Meadows. "What about Ruby?" Elsie asked, the question that cut deepest. "What about all the animals we've been helping?" This was the cruelest aspect of their situation. Ruby, despite her adaptability and intelligence, was bonded to this specific territory. The workshop held Samuel's scent and memories that anchored her sense of security. The surrounding woodland provided the familiar pathways and hiding spots essential to her psychological well-being. Dr. Morrison, summoned for an emergency consultation, confirmed Elsie's worst fears. Relocating Ruby would be extremely traumatic. Foxes are territorial creatures, and she's been here for nearly 3 years. Moving her to an unfamiliar area could cause severe behavioral problems, depression, or worse. "There must be something we can do," Ruth said desperately. "Some legal option, some way to fight this." The developer's representative, a polished man named Marcus Henderson, who visited the following day, showed no interest in their emotional attachments to the property. He toured the grounds with the calculating gaze of someone seeing dollar signs, rather than the carefully tended spaces where 3 generations of Whitmores had built their lives. "I understand your sentimental attachment," Henderson said, with practiced sympathy, "but progress requires difficult decisions. This area needs modern housing for young families, not outdated structures and unused woodland." When his gaze fell on Ruby, who watched him warily from the workshop doorway, his expression shifted to mild annoyance. "You'll need to make arrangements for that animal before settlement. The new owners won't want wild animals on their property." The casual dismissal of Ruby as merely that animal ignited something fierce in Elsie. "She's not just an animal. She lives here. This is her home too." Henderson's smile was patronizing. "I'm sure you can find somewhere appropriate for her, perhaps a zoo or wildlife sanctuary." After Henderson left, promising to return with final paperwork within the week, Elsie sat in the workshop with Ruby, surrounded by Samuel's tools and the evidence of their months of wildlife rescue work. The fox seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed, remaining closer than usual and watching Elsie with concerned attention. "I won't let them destroy this place," Elsie said aloud, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Grandfather trusted us to continue his work, and we're not giving up." Ruth, overhearing from the doorway, approached with mixed admiration and concern. "Elsie, dear, I understand how you feel, but sometimes we have to accept situations we can't change." "Grandfather never accepted that," Elsie replied firmly. "He saw problems and found solutions. He helped animals everyone else ignored. He built things that made life better." That evening, Elsie began researching everything she could about property rights, conservation laws, and wildlife protection. Using the library's outdated computer and Mrs. Peterson's help with internet searches, she discovered something that sparked the first hope she had felt since receiving Henderson's letter. Local properties with demonstrated environmental or historical significance could potentially qualify for protection under state conservation programs. Properties that served as wildlife habitats might be eligible for sanctuary designation, which could prevent or delay development. The key word was demonstrated. Elsie would need to prove that Samuel's property served a vital ecological function that warranted protection. Fortunately, she had exactly the documentation required. Samuel's meticulous wildlife journals, combined with her own careful records of their rescue activities, provided detailed evidence of the property's role in supporting local animal populations. Dr. Morrison's medical records of treated animals added professional credibility to their claims. "You might actually have a case," Dr. Morrison said when Elsie presented her research to him. "The documentation is thorough, and the bridge area especially could qualify as a critical habitat corridor. The process would be complicated and time-consuming, requiring legal assistance they couldn't afford, and navigating bureaucratic procedures designed to favor developers with political connections." Henderson Development Corporation had resources and influence that a grieving widow and 8-year-old girl could barely comprehend, much less combat effectively. But as Elsie sat in the workshop that night, reading Samuel's journal entries about never giving up on creatures others had written off as hopeless, she felt his guidance as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. Ruby approached and settled against her feet, purring softly, her signal of complete trust and contentment. Looking down at the fox, who had taught her so much about loyalty and persistence, Elsie made a decision that would have made her grandfather proud. "We're going to fight this, Ruby. I don't know how yet, but we're going to save our home and all the animals who need it." The fox looked up at her with amber eyes that seemed to reflect complete confidence in whatever plan Elsie might develop. Together, they would find a way to preserve Samuel's legacy and continue the work that had brought meaning to both their lives. The battle for Millhaven's heart was about to begin. The campaign to save Samuel's property began with a single phone call to the State Conservation Department and grew into something that transformed the entire community of Millhaven. Within days of Elsie's initial inquiry, word had spread through the informal networks of kindness that connect small towns, reaching people who had never heard of Ruby or Samuel's wildlife work, but who understood instinctively what was at stake. Dr. Morrison became their first crucial ally, lending professional credibility to their conservation claims. His examination of Samuel's journals revealed patterns of animal care that impressed even experienced wildlife biologists. The documented cases of successful rehabilitation, the careful tracking of local animal populations, and the detailed observations about habitat usage painted a picture of amateur wildlife management that rivaled professional operations. "Your grandfather was doing scientific work without realizing it," Dr. Morrison told Elsie as they prepared documentation for the Conservation Department. These records could support graduate-level research about wildlife corridor usage and rehabilitation success rates. The state conservation officer who visited to assess their claims a woman named Janet Clearwater with weathered hands and kind eyes, spent an entire afternoon examining the property with the thoroughness of someone who understood both legal requirements and ecological realities. Ruby's behavior during the inspection amazed everyone present. Rather than hiding from the stranger, as might be expected, the fox seemed to understand the importance of the visit and actively participated in demonstrating the property's value to wildlife. She led Officer Clearwater to each feeding station, showed her the bridge improvements, and even brought her to the locations where they had successfully released rehabilitated animals. In 30 years of wildlife work, I've never seen anything like this, Officer Clearwater told Ruth and Elsie as they concluded the inspection. The documentation is extraordinary, and the physical evidence of successful wildlife management is undeniable. This property qualifies for emergency conservation review, which could delay development for up to 6 months. 6 months felt like a lifetime to Elsie, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The conservation review process would require community support, environmental impact studies, and legal challenges that demanded resources far beyond what their family possessed. That evening, as Elsie sat in the workshop recording the day's progress in her journal, Ruby approached with something carefully carried in her mouth, a folded piece of paper that had somehow found its way into the fox's possession. Unfolding the paper revealed a hand-drawn map of Samuel's property, created by Tommy Peterson, showing every shelter, feeding station, and improvement they had made over the months. At the bottom, in Tommy's careful printing, were the words, "Ruby's home, worth saving." "Tommy made this for us," Elsie told Ruby, who seemed pleased by the recognition of her territorial boundaries. "He understands what we're fighting for." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Miss Caroline arrived at their kitchen door, carrying a manila folder thick with documents, and wearing an expression of determined purpose that Elsie had never seen outside the classroom. "I've been doing some research," she announced without preamble, settling at the kitchen table with the air of someone prepared for serious business, "about Samuel's property and Henderson Development Corporation." The folder contained information that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Henderson Development had a history of acquiring rural properties through aggressive financial pressure, then building developments that consistently ignored local environmental regulations and community planning guidelines. "They've done this before," Miss Caroline explained, spreading newspaper clippings and legal documents across the table. 3 times in neighboring counties. Each time, they identified financially vulnerable property owners, created pressure through debt collection or tax disputes, then purchased land at below-market prices. More disturbing was the pattern of environmental damage left behind by Henderson's projects. Wetlands filled illegally, wildlife corridors severed, and water quality degraded by poor construction practices. In each case, the company had paid modest fines after completion rather than adhering to environmental protections during construction. "They're counting on you being too overwhelmed to fight back effectively," Miss Caroline said. "But they haven't dealt with a community that understands what it's losing." That afternoon, Miss Caroline organized what she diplomatically termed a community information meeting at the elementary school. Word spread with the efficiency of rural communication networks, and by evening, the school cafeteria was filled with neighbors who had come to learn about the threat to Samuel's property and the wildlife sanctuary Elsie had been developing. Mrs. Henderson, despite her reputation for nosiness, proved to be a passionate advocate for preserving the woodland, areas where she had enjoyed watching birds for decades. The Morrison farm family, whose property bordered Samuel's land, spoke eloquently about the importance of maintaining wildlife corridors that connected the remaining forest patches in their increasingly developed county. Even more surprising was the number of people who had benefited directly from Samuel's quiet kindness over the years. Farmer Joe Mackenzie credited Samuel with helping him build the barn that had saved his livestock operation during a devastating storm. The widow Patterson tearfully described how Samuel had secretly repaired her roof after her husband's death, refusing payment and asking only that she not tell others about his assistance. "Samuel Whitmore was the heart of this community," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the crowded cafeteria. "If we let developers destroy his legacy, we lose something that can never be replaced." By the end of the evening, 37 community members had signed a petition supporting conservation protection for Samuel's property. More importantly, they had formed committees to handle different aspects of the legal and publicity challenges ahead. Dr. Morrison volunteered to coordinate with environmental groups that might provide legal assistance. Miss Caroline took responsibility for media outreach and documentation. Mrs. Henderson, putting her observational skills to constructive use, became their liaison with county government officials who might influence the conservation review process. The transformation of their private struggle into a community cause created momentum that Henderson Development Corporation clearly hadn't anticipated. Marcus Henderson's return visit the following week revealed a man considerably less confident than during his initial assessment. "I understand there's been some local opposition to our development plans," he said, his smooth professionalism slightly strained. "I hope you understand that emotional attachments to property can't override legitimate business considerations." Elsie, emboldened by the community support and armed with information Miss Caroline had provided about Henderson's questionable practices, responded with newfound confidence. "I hope you understand that destroying wildlife habitats and ignoring environmental laws can't override community values." Henderson's expression shifted to something approaching respect, though his determination remained unchanged. "You're quite articulate for someone your age, but legal challenges are expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful against established development companies." After Henderson left, promising to proceed with settlement preparations despite local opposition, Elsie realized that their fight had moved beyond simple property preservation. They were challenging a system that prioritized profit over environmental protection, developer convenience over community values. That evening, as she and Ruby conducted their customary patrol of the feeding stations and shelter areas, Elsie reflected on how much had changed since she first discovered the frightened, injured fox limping near Samuel's workshop. The scared, grieving child who had reluctantly accepted responsibility for one vulnerable animal had become someone willing to fight powerful interests to protect an entire ecosystem. Ruby, perhaps sensing the significance of the moment, led Elsie to a spot they rarely visited, a small clearing where Samuel had apparently sat for his own moments of reflection, evidenced by a smooth stone positioned perfectly for watching the sunset through the trees. Sitting on her grandfather's meditation stone with Ruby curled contentedly beside her, Elsie felt his presence more strongly than at any time since his death. The fight ahead would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed, but she was no longer facing it alone. The community had rallied around Samuel's legacy, recognizing that preserving his wildlife sanctuary meant preserving something essential about their own values and identity. Whatever challenges Henderson Development Corporation might present, they would face them together, guided by the example of a man who had quietly made the world better, one rescued creature at a time. Tomorrow would bring new battles in there. Campaign to save Ruby's home and continue Samuel's work. But tonight, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the woodland he had protected, Elsie felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The county courthouse in Cedar Falls had never seen anything quite like the gathering that assembled on the morning of December 15th. What had begun as a routine development approval hearing had transformed into a community referendum on the values that would guide Millhaven's future. Elsie sat in the front row between Ruth and Dr. Morrison, her hands folded carefully over the folder containing Samuel's wildlife documentation and her own carefully prepared statement. Ruby, of course, couldn't attend the formal hearing, but her presence was represented by dozens of photographs showing her partnership with Elsie in caring for the local wildlife population. The hearing room filled steadily as Millhaven residents arrived in numbers that surprised even the community organizers. Miss Caroline had arranged transportation for elderly neighbors who rarely left their homes, while Tommy Peterson's father had closed his hardware store for the morning to attend with his family. County Planning Commissioner Robert Hayes called the hearing to order with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many of these battles between developers and communities. Henderson Development Corporation was represented by 3 attorneys in expensive suits, while the community's interests were defended by a single environmental lawyer who had volunteered his services after reading about their cause in the regional newspaper. Marcus Henderson presented his case with polished efficiency, emphasizing the economic benefits of new housing development, the property taxes that would support county services, and the modern amenities that would attract young families to the area. His presentation included professional architectural renderings of Millhaven meadows that made the proposed development look like a peaceful suburban paradise. Progress requires difficult choices, Henderson concluded, echoing his earlier words to Ruth and Elsie. While we understand the emotional attachments some residents feel to this property, we cannot allow sentiment to override legitimate development needs. When Commissioner Hayes called for community response, Miss Caroline rose first, her teacher's voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed room. She presented the petition signed by community members, then introduced the environmental documentation that Dr. Morrison and Elsie had prepared. "This is not about sentiment," Miss Caroline said firmly. "This is about documented ecological value and scientifically verified wildlife management practices that have created a functional habitat corridor benefiting the entire county." Dr. Morrison followed with a presentation that impressed even Henderson's legal team. Using Samuel's meticulous records and Elsie's continued documentation, he demonstrated patterns of animal migration, rehabilitation success rates, and habitat usage that supported official wildlife sanctuary designation. The Whitmore property serves as a crucial connection between fragmented forest areas, Dr. Morrison explained, using maps to illustrate wildlife movement patterns. Eliminating this corridor would isolate animal populations and significantly reduce biodiversity throughout the region. When Commissioner Hayes invited Elsie to speak, the room fell silent with the anticipation that accompanies moments when children step into adult responsibilities. She approached the podium with the same careful determination she had learned from watching Samuel work with frightened animals. "My name is Elsie Mae Whitmore," she began, her young voice clear and steady. "Despite her racing heart, the property Henderson Development wants to destroy is my home, but more importantly, it's home to dozens of animals who depend on the sanctuary my grandfather created." She spoke about Ruby's story, about the injured and orphaned animals Samuel had quietly helped over the years, and about the network of feeding stations, shelter areas, and safe corridors they had developed. As she described specific rescue cases, complete with names and outcomes, even the developers' attorneys found themselves listening with unexpected attention. "My grandfather taught me that every living thing has value and deserves protection," Elsie continued. "He never asked for recognition or payment for helping animals that couldn't help themselves. He just did what he knew was right." The emotional impact of her words was evident throughout the room. But Elsie hadn't finished. She opened Samuel's original wildlife journal and read selected entries that demonstrated the scope and dedication of his conservation work. Young barn owl, wing fracture from collision with power line. Treated for 6 weeks, released successfully. Noted, power company agreed to install protectors after I showed them injury patterns. My grandfather didn't just help individual animals, he worked to prevent the problems that hurt them. As she concluded her presentation, Elsie looked directly at Commissioner Hayes, then at Marcus Henderson and his legal team. Henderson Development says this is about progress, but destroying something that works to build something that might work isn't progress, it's waste. The room erupted in applause that took Commissioner Hayes several minutes to control. Even Henderson's attorneys seemed affected by the presentation, though their client's expression remained coldly professional. When the community testimony concluded, Commissioner Hayes announced that the Planning Commission would deliberate for 30 minutes before rendering their decision. The supporters of Samuel's sanctuary gathered in the courthouse lobby, their nervous energy creating a buzz of conversation and speculation about possible outcomes. Elsie stood quietly beside the courthouse windows, watching winter birds gather. Around the building's ornamental trees, whatever happened in the next half hour would determine whether Ruby's home survived and whether Samuel's legacy of kindness could withstand the forces that prioritized profit over compassion. When Commissioner Hayes called the hearing back to order, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elsie returned to her seat between Ruth and Dr. Morrison, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Across the aisle, Marcus Henderson sat with confident posture, but she noticed his attorneys shuffling through their papers with movements that suggested less certainty than their client displayed. The Planning Commission has reviewed all testimony and documentation presented today, Commissioner Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would affect dozens of lives. This case presents unusual circumstances that require careful consideration of both development needs and environmental protection. Elsie felt Ruth's hand find hers and squeeze gently. Around them, the entire Millhaven community seemed to hold its breath. Henderson Development Corporation has presented a legally sound development proposal that meets standard county requirements for residential construction. The economic benefits and housing needs they have identified are legitimate considerations. In our planning decisions, Henderson's smile suggested he believed victory was imminent, but Commissioner Hayes wasn't finished. However, the community has presented extraordinary documentation of existing wildlife conservation activities that demonstrate the property's unique ecological value. The Whitmore family's wildlife management records, spanning multiple years, and dozens of successful animal rehabilitations constitute evidence of habitat utilization that cannot be ignored. Dr. Morrison leaned forward, his expression cautiously hopeful. Miss Caroline gripped her folder of community support letters with white knuckles. Furthermore, the community support for preserving this wildlife corridor reflects legitimate environmental concerns that align with our county's stated commitment to sustainable development practices. Commissioner Hayes paused, surveying the packed hearing room with the measured gaze of someone who understood the broader implications of his decision. After careful deliberation, the Planning Commission has voted to deny Henderson Development Corporation's current proposal and to recommend the Whitmore property for emergency conservation review under the State Wildlife Corridor Protection Act. The room exploded in cheers and applause. Ruth burst into tears, pulling Elsie into a fierce hug, while Dr. Morrison shook hands with everyone within reach. Miss Caroline was openly crying with relief, and even Mrs. Henderson was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Marcus Henderson, however, was already conferring intensely with his legal team, his expression suggesting this was far from over. The conservation review process will take approximately 60 days, Commissioner Hayes continued once order was restored. During this period, no development activities may commence on the property. The State Conservation Department will conduct environmental impact studies and determine whether permanent wildlife sanctuary designation is appropriate. As the crowd began to disperse, Henderson approached Elsie and Ruth with grudging respect in his expression. "You fought well," he admitted, "but conservation reviews can be overturned, and development pressure in this county will only increase. This may be a temporary victory." Elsie, still glowing with the triumph of their success, looked up at the developer with newfound confidence. "Mr. Henderson, my grandfather taught me that temporary victories can become permanent ones if you keep working for what's right." The drive back to Millhaven passed in a blur of celebration and relief. Every car that passed them on the country road honked in recognition, and several neighbors had gathered at the Whitmore property to welcome them home with handmade signs reading, "Ruby's home saved," and "Samuel's sanctuary lives on." Ruby herself seemed to sense the good news the moment Elsie stepped out of the car. The fox bounded toward her with more energy than she had displayed since her injury, circling Elsie's legs and purring with fox contentment that brought fresh tears to everyone's eyes. "She knows," Dr. Morrison observed with wonder. "Somehow she knows we won." That evening the workshop became the center of an impromptu celebration, as neighbors brought covered dishes and hot cider to share the victory. Tommy Peterson had created a banner reading "Samuel's Wildlife Sanctuary, official recognition pending," which they hung between the workshop windows. As darkness fell and the neighbors gradually departed for their own homes, Elsie sat in Samuel's chair with Ruby curled contentedly in her lap, both of them exhausted but deeply satisfied. The bronze plaque that would eventually mark the property as an official wildlife sanctuary was still weeks away, but the most important battle had been won. "Grandfather would be so proud," Ruth said softly, settling into the chair beside them, with her evening cup of tea. "Not just of saving the property, but of how you grew into someone who could lead this fight." Elsie stroked Ruby's fur gently, feeling the fox's peaceful breathing and thinking about all the animals who would continue to find safety and care in the sanctuary that bore Samuel's name. The work would continue, the seasonal rounds of feeding and rescue and rehabilitation that gave meaning to both their lives. "We did it together," she said simply. "All of us, you, me, Ruby, Dr. Morrison, Miss Caroline, everyone who understood what we were fighting for." Ruby opened one amber eye and looked up at Elsie with an expression that seemed to convey complete agreement and satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new animals to help, but tonight, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of their protected woodland, they could rest in the knowledge that love had found a way to continue, stronger than ever. 6 months later, on a warm May morning that painted the sanctuary in shades of green that Samuel would have loved, Elsie sat in her grandfather's old rocking chair, watching Ruby demonstrate proper den construction to a young fox family they had been caring for since early spring. The bronze plaque beside the workshop door caught the morning light, its inscription reading, "Samuel's Wildlife Haven, established in memory of Samuel Whitmore, friend to all creatures." The transformation of their quiet family struggle into a community triumph had changed more than just the legal status of the property. Millhaven itself had evolved into something Samuel could never have imagined when he first began secretly caring for injured animals in his workshop. Dr. Morrison had helped Elsie establish formal protocols for wildlife rehabilitation that impressed state conservation officials. Their success rate with injured animals now served as a model for other rural sanctuaries throughout the region. School groups visited regularly to learn about wildlife care, turning Ruby into something of a celebrity, who seemed to enjoy her role as ambassador to the human world. "She's a natural teacher," observed Janet Clearwater, the state conservation officer who had become a regular visitor and unofficial advisor to their operation. "I've never seen a wild animal so comfortable with educational programs." Ruby's ability to remain calm and demonstrative during school visits had made her invaluable for teaching children about wildlife behavior and the importance of conservation. She would allow gentle petting from well-behaved children, demonstrate hunting techniques with toys rather than live prey, and even participate in feeding demonstrations that showed visitors how different animals required different types of care. The success of Samuel's wildlife haven had attracted attention from unexpected sources. A wildlife photography magazine had featured Ruby and Elsie on their cover, with an article about the girl who saved a town's heart. The accompanying photographs, taken by a professional who spent a week documenting their daily routines, captured the remarkable partnership between child and fox that continued to amaze everyone who witnessed it. More importantly, their victory had inspired similar conservation efforts in neighboring communities. 3 other rural sanctuaries had been established using Samuel's documentation methods and Elsie's community organizing techniques. Henderson Development Corporation, stung by their public defeat and the negative publicity that followed, had quietly abandoned several similar projects throughout the county. "Your grandfather started something bigger than he ever knew," Ruth told Elsie as they prepared the morning feeding rounds. At 73, Ruth had found new purpose in managing the sanctuary's administrative needs, corresponding with other wildlife rehabilitation centers and maintaining the detailed records that conservation officials required. The financial pressures that had nearly destroyed their family had been resolved through unexpected means. The magazine article led to donations from animal lovers across the country, while their official sanctuary status qualified them for state funding that covered basic operational expenses. Dr. Morrison had arranged for veterinary students to complete internships at the sanctuary, providing additional expertise while reducing medical costs. Most surprisingly, several local businesses had discovered that association with Samuel's wildlife haven enhanced their reputations in ways that translated to increased customer loyalty. The hardware store now carried wildlife-approved building materials, the feed store stocked specialized animal foods, and the local veterinary clinic had expanded to offer wildlife services throughout the county. Tommy Peterson, now 10 and increasingly skilled at animal care, had become Elsie's unofficial partner in the daily sanctuary operations. His enthusiasm for the work matched her own, and his patient gentleness with frightened animals reminded everyone of Samuel's approach to wildlife rehabilitation. "I think I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up," Tommy announced one afternoon, while helping Elsie tend to a hawk recovering from a wing injury. "But I want to specialize in wild animals, like Dr. Morrison does for farms." The sanctuary had become home to a rotating population of creatures recovering from injuries, orphaned, young animals learning survival skills, and permanent residents like Ruby, who couldn't be safely returned to completely wild conditions. Each animal received individualized care based on the protocols Samuel had developed and Elsie had refined through experience and study. On this particular May morning, as Elsie watched Ruby's patient instruction of the young fox family, she reflected on how much her understanding of her grandfather's legacy had deepened. What she had initially seen as his kindness to individual animals, she now recognized as a comprehensive philosophy about the interconnectedness of all living things. "Every creature teaches us something," Samuel had written in one of his final journal entries. "Ruby taught me about loyalty that survives loss. The injured hawk taught me about dignity in the face of limitation. The orphaned raccoons taught me about the resilience of hope. If we pay attention, every animal we help helps us in return." The workshop had evolved into a proper rehabilitation facility with separate areas for different types of animals and equipment that would have impressed professional wildlife managers. But it retained the peaceful atmosphere Samuel had created, filled with the scents of cedar and the sounds of contented animals recovering their strength. As afternoon approached and the daily visitor groups began arriving for educational programs, Elsie settled into her grandfather's rocking chair with Ruby beside her, both of them prepared for another day of sharing their story with people who needed to understand that individual actions could create lasting change. The chair had been Samuel's favorite spot for watching the woodland come alive each morning, and it had become Elsie's place for reflecting on the work that continued to unfold around them. From this vantage point, she could see the feeding stations they maintained, the shelter areas they had improved, and the bridge that had been designated as a historical landmark representing community cooperation in wildlife conservation. More than the physical improvements, however, she could see the continuation of something Samuel had begun without fanfare or recognition, the quiet revolution of treating every living creature with dignity and care. Ruby, now healthy and content, was no longer just a rescued fox, but a teacher, showing visitors and volunteers alike that wildness and trust could coexist when love provided the foundation. As the sun moved toward evening and Ruby settled more comfortably beside the rocking chair, Elsie understood that her grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the sanctuary itself, but the knowledge that love creates its own legacy, growing stronger with each person it touches and each life it changes.